Welcome to the latest episode of the Hard Truth About B2B eCommerce. I'm your host, Isaiah Bollinger. Unfortunately, Tim is not with us, where this is our, Christmas holiday episode. We're just a few days out from the holidays. So the last episode we'll be recording before the holidays. And before I get into it, I just want to quickly mention our sponsors. Our original sponsor who agreed to sponsor before we even had a podcast is Punch Out to Go. If you don't know them, they are one of the leaders in integrations and iPaaS for B2B companies to automate the purchasing process on behalf of B2B companies' customers, and they can immediately reduce the complexity and the manual processes in the purchasing, behavior and path of B2B companies via integrating your systems through ERP or from e-commerce to ERP with your customers, so they can really reduce the problems that you may have in terms of adoption via e-commerce. So check out Punch Out to Go. They're one of the people that have been in the B2B industry for a very long time. They know all the major ERP systems and can help you with integrations and much more than just ERP. I'm naming some of the main buzzwords. Balance is our second sponsor. They're a newer company. A lot of people haven't heard of them in the B2B space because they're very new. They're the first checkout payment gateway totally dedicated to B2B e-commerce. So what does that mean? They're focused on things like accounts receivable, credit terms, multiple different payment methods, all the flexibility that business customers want with e-commerce. They're not just a traditional payment gateway where you put in your credit card and that's all you get. They will handle all of the things that your customers need from a B2B e-commerce standpoint, so that when they buy online, it feels just like they are buying the old way, which was potentially offline or on the phone and things like that. So check out Balance, check out Punch Out to Go, two great companies in the B2B space that have really helped a lot of B2B companies. And I can't, say more about that other than just check them out. Really excited to bring on Mike King from Slalom. He's our second Slalom guest. I believe it's the other Mike who was on earlier. And I think he runs the B2B practice. You run more of the B2C practice. But as we all know, B2C and B2B are overlapping more and more these days. And you also, your background before Slalom, I know you did quite a bit of B2B at some of the companies that are similar to Trellis, who's our agency, who gives me the freedom to have time to do this podcast. So tell us about your background, how you got involved at Slalom, and you've been in e-commerce pretty much your whole career from what I understand. So
yeah, that's about right. I went to school to be a structural engineer originally. That's my undergrad, and then I spent a number of years working for an engineering firm writing software for them, but pretty quickly realized that I was more interested in web technology, and then really early in my career made the switch to e-commerce. At the time I was working on Demandware, which is the predecessor to Salesforce B2C Commerce before their acquisition. So doing that
how early was this? How was this? I forget when Demandware came out. Was this like early days and they were still very new, or?
Yeah, I think they'd probably been around for 5 or 6 years by the time I got involved. So they had integrated, they had switched to a partner model a few years before that. A couple of folks who'd been at Salesforce started their own firm, and that's kind of where I was working. So they had kind of splintered off from the mothership. Sorry, Demandware splintered off from the mothership there. So yeah, I kind of been along for that whole ride as Salesforce gobbled up Demandware, and I've been working in B2C commerce and architecture and solution architecture over the last almost 3 years now, though. I've been really spending a lot of my time on Salesforce cross-cloud solution architecture, which is sort of that intersection of commerce and marketing and service and integration and sort of all of the components that it takes to make a commerce implementation successful in the long term, really just beyond the transactional commerce engine. And that's more complicated, I think, than sometimes people appreciate, even when you're buying a bunch of Salesforce stuff off the shelf, because they bought, Demandware used to be a different product, and Exact Target used to be a different product, and they're kind of pulling it all together, but that takes a little specialization. So
Yeah.
that's my background. At this point, I run B2C commerce for Slalom globally, and have recently inherited some responsibility for the B2B side of the house. Mike Dortberg is primarily B2B sales and does a lot of other sales activities, but delivery and running the practice stuff kind of falls onto my shoulders recently. So that's new and exciting for me. I got a lot to learn about the B2B ecosystem, not where I've spent all of my time, but some in the last year or so, really trying to get up to speed on B2B, both as an industry and as a technology, Salesforce specifically.
So, I mean, there's so much overlap more and more, I feel like, every year between B2B and B2C. Like, how do you guys differentiate? Like, does sometimes the B2C customers that you get become B2B, or they become a hybrid customer? Like, how do you guys treat that if there's, quite a bit of overlap, especially like a manufacturer brand that might be direct to consumer, but also have a huge B2B component, like, which I know a lot of Salesforce customers are like that, right? Like, trying to think of one off the top of my head, but like an Adidas, I think, is on Salesforce Commerce Cloud. I want to say it might be Adidas.
Yeah, they are. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of overlap, and that kind of comes in a few different areas, right? I think everybody is aware of the fact that traditional B2B customers are coming to expect just a better experience when they shop online. They're expecting an experience that mirrors what they had in their last B2C interaction, which is designed for consumers who really aren't committed to your brand. They're flirting with it, they're exploring it, can just as easily switch over and shop somewhere else.
They might just be a one-time purchase. But
yeah, exactly.
B2B, there's typically a likelihood that they'll be probably more likelihood they'll be buying again. If your product sells, if you're buying from Adidas, you're hopefully going to be continuing to restocking them.
Yeah, there's a lot more traction there.
Yeah.
And I think, that can lead to just an expectation or a behavior that is just sort of like, all I need to do is facilitate your purchase. I don't really need to like woo you. But I think that customer experience has been more front and center, at least in a lot of the B2B interactions we've had. I think in the Salesforce space, it's particularly interesting because the Salesforce B2B commerce product and the Salesforce B2C commerce product are completely different technologies with different capabilities, and building an implementation on one doesn't really help you if you want to use the other. So I think where it gets interesting for us is we've definitely seen a lot of clients who are using the B2C commerce product with B2B use cases. If they have both channels, or they have, for example, we worked with a client that sells chocolates online. It's a direct-to-consumer website, but they also support bulk ordering to sell to, if you want to send all of your employees a box of chocolates or something, or you want to like put them in cars at a showroom or something like that. So those overlapping use cases, I think, are interesting.
Yeah, and how are people navigating that with Salesforce? Like, are they often buying both platforms once they are like, we want to level up B2B, so now we need to buy the B2B platform? I think it was originally called Cloud Craze, and now it's the Salesforce platform, or Salesforce B2B. Are you seeing a lot of companies buying both, or are you seeing people trying to use the main Commerce Cloud and convert it into kind of B2B use cases? What I'm just curious. Like, honestly, I have no idea. We're a lot really in the Salesforce ecosystem at Trellis, so
Yeah, it goes both directions. So the product that was Cloud Craze got acquired, that became B2B Classic about a year ago. Salesforce essentially re-implemented B2B on the Lightning platforms. That's called B2B Lightning. That's all they're selling these days, and that's core Salesforce. So that sits right alongside your Sales Cloud or Service Cloud or CPQ, all of those kind of core customer relationship management tools that are what Salesforce is really known for. And we've definitely used that kind of B2B product for some light B2C cases and vice versa. There are clients who do buy both, and then they kind of have to learn two different technologies. But I think Salesforce is sort of recognized this in June of 2021. So fairly recently, they debuted a new product. It's called B2B2C, but it's essentially allows for current B2B customers who are using the B2B Lightning tool to stand up a direct-to-consumer channel on the Lightning platform and sell essentially B2C use cases using the same kind of tools and technology that they use for B2B. So that's given us a little bit more flexibility to say, you want to try out direct-to-consumer, you're a manufacturer, you don't want to have a different product catalog and different inventory and different pricing. You want to reuse all that stuff. So you can do it on the same technology now, which is given us some new options, but it's definitely an exploration. The cost of having those two different technologies and two different licenses isn't always justified.
Yeah, it's not always a good fit for everyone. So what is a good fit for people in the Salesforce ecosystem? Just out of curiosity, like how, I mean, I assume you guys, can tell when someone's just not a good fit, or they're maybe just smaller. They might need to be like a Shopify type company, or where do you guys kind of draw the line, or tell people like, hey, look, you're just not ready for this right now?
It depends on, the two different technologies kind of have different criteria, I would say. The traditional Salesforce B2C commerce, classic, that enterprise B2C commerce, that was really geared towards merchants. I would say 15 million a year or more in GMV online sales.
15 or 50? Sorry.
15, 15, it was kind of like the low end.
So but fairly sophisticated, you're not just starting out, like you're at that 15 to 20 million. You're somewhat mature, probably had an e-commerce site for a decent amount of time at that point.
Exactly. Yeah. I can only think of once in my career doing this where we've done an implementation for a client for whom this was their very first foray into e-commerce.
Yeah, that makes sense. So generally it's they've been on e-commerce. Maybe they were on Shopify or another platform. They've outgrown it, or they've, whatever path they got to. It's usually not their first e-commerce site. I mean, this is the Demandware legacy, right? I always remember them having fairly large clients, fairly sophisticated clients, like Adidas. I'm just mentioning them because they're the one like top of mind that I know has been on it for a long time. Or at least I'm pretty sure they have been. So that makes a lot of sense. So it sounds like that product's pretty mature, more enterprise, probably not for the small business that isn't there.
Right. The real thing that it does that the core Salesforce doesn't do is super high transaction volumes. Like it's going to get the largest merchants through Black Friday without breaking a sweat. That's really what it's geared for. B2B can be much more scrappy. That barrier to entry is much lower. It's much more.
I think that's what Mike told me, is they had a lot of people that are just brand new to B2B, and they have Salesforce, so it's kind of
place to play.
Yeah.
You can stand that up relatively easily, especially if you're already using Sales Cloud or CPQ or something. Just adding a B2B portal to sell those products directly.
If you don't mind me asking, what would it cost for someone to get started? Are we talking 100,000, 300,000, 50,000? Like, it's some ballpark for people to understand what they're looking at.
Yeah, it's obviously, like everything, it depends. I would say
I'm talking on the B2B side, not the B2B. We know the B2C side is quite a big lift, but B2B.
Yeah, I would say 200,000 to 300,000. It depends if you're just looking to kind of get something stood up and you don't have a very complex integration ecosystem or complex customization needs. Like, obviously, if you have a lot more in terms of integrations that you need to support, that's going to drive things up, or custom functionality. But standing up, with the support of an SI partner is going to be
so definitely less than like an SAP Hybris, but probably similar to like a smaller, the small mid-sized Magento kind of projects, maybe.
Right. And that's really geared towards let's get something stood up, see if we can get traction with our customers, see if this makes sense, and then iterate on it from there. I think that's really the model that we encourage with this.
And most of these people, I'm guessing, are already. So let's talk about the Salesforce ecosystem a little bit, and then I want to move on. I don't want to spend the whole time talking about Salesforce, but
sure.
I'm asking these questions because it's such a big platform, big ecosystem, and a lot of people just don't know it. So honestly, I'm just hoping that for people that don't know it, or I know people that just have the CRM and they don't necessarily, and I think that's almost like a mistake, right? Like if you're gonna have the CRM, you probably should be considering Pardot or whatever, the Service Cloud, or there's other tools. So typically on the B2B side or B2C side, what are you kind of seeing as some of the commonalities or things that people should be looking at? Like obviously you have the core CRM, just pretty much like the original product, right? That's evolved and it's constantly newer and newer, but it's still the same kind of CRM product, right? Is that?
Yeah, Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, it is an interesting ecosystem of acquisitions and developed technology
And apps. I know I was on the app website. I was like, holy crap, there's a lot of apps.
yeah, there's a lot to that. So this is really where I spend a lot of my time lately. I actually just released a book a couple of months ago on Salesforce B2C solution architecture that was all about the intersection of all these different technologies and how to design a solution.
What's it called?
Salesforce B2C Solution Architect's Handbook. Yeah, it's on Amazon right now. So so I did that because there's a new certification that's really around how to use all these products together, and it's proving challenging. I think because people come from either the Demandware background or the Exact Target background or a Salesforce background, but you really have to understand all of those different things. I would say in the B2C space, the like trilogy that we see all the time is Commerce Cloud plus Service Cloud plus Marketing Cloud. Those three things together let you, market to your customers, bring in new customers, support your existing customers, and sell stuff. I think that's.
Tell us about the Service Cloud. I don't know a ton about that. I think we've tested it out and messed around with it. Oh no, sorry, I'm confusing that with a different product actually. No, but yeah, actually, I really don't know it. So tell me more about that.
So that's the core CRM Salesforce Lightning product that is designed to customer service use cases. So think live chat.
Okay, so it's the CRM with support. All of that included. Is that additional cost, or is it just part of the CRM and you get that all in one?
It's a licensed product that sits on top of that. So the way that the core Salesforce, that CRM product works, is that there's a ton of licensed products that unlock additional objects functionality.
So it's like an upcharge, it's like a premium version.
Yeah, exactly.
CRM. Yep.
And
so
it
you're
does
talking
things like
CRM, add the contact, but then I can service them and see support tickets.
Yeah, it does things like
live chat,
omnichannel routing and agent specialization, and gets you to the right person, and knowledge support, all sorts of things like that. So that trilogy works.
And I would imagine like banks are using this. I mean, stuff like that, I'm thinking of the annoying calling a bank is like the worst thing ever, right? When you're
yeah, I wouldn't blame that on the technology, but yes.
Well, I'm just thinking like this is way beyond just commerce because it's such a big product, but this is the commerce use case. Sorry, I'm not trying to, I just want to be clear because it's such a big ecosystem. So
yeah, absolutely. So those three have a lot of synergy in the B2C space. On the B2B side, I'd say it's more like Sales Cloud.
Can I ask one more question? Sure. Sorry, is Exact Target part of the Marketing Cloud?
Yeah, So Marketing Cloud, much like Commerce Cloud, is an umbrella term that includes a bunch of different products. So, but what I'm talking about is the product that used to be called Exact Target. It's sometimes referred to as the messaging and journeys product. So it's customer journey or automation.
Where does Pardot fit into that? Isn't Pardot?
Pardot is in the Marketing Cloud suite, but it's a totally different technology that's really aimed towards B2B use cases. So
gotcha.
A little bit different capability.
So on the B2B side, it's more of the Exact Target Marketing Cloud suite plus the CRM service suite plus the Commerce Cloud suite, which has evolved and started as Demandware. Now I'm sure it's that's way B2C, more sophisticated now. Yep. So that's like the core three that you see, and then obviously people have all sorts of other stuff.
Exactly. Yeah. Order management, MuleSoft, all sorts of other things complement that.
Yeah, MuleSoft's a really cool technology, but also pretty enterprise. So probably not for everyone.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. Mostly we use that if a customer already has it as their enterprise integration strategy, then it's a great tool to leverage. But if they don't, it's a hard sell for just the commerce use cases.
Or they have tons of different ERP. I've seen these large companies where they have like an ERP in Europe that's different from the ERP.
Yes.
Like they'll have like literally multiple, or they buy companies and they're still stuck on different ERPs. So that's where I could see that being useful.
Definitely useful in those cases. Yeah. On the B2B side, I'd say it tends to be like Sales Cloud instead of Service Cloud. It tends to be Pardot instead of Marketing Cloud, and then B2B commerce instead of B2C commerce. It's that same sort of.
What's the Sales Cloud? Sorry, I don't know.
Sales Cloud is probably the closest to the original Salesforce product. It's what kind of people think of when they think of Salesforce.
CRM,
it's leads and opportunities and supporting your.
That's
Salesforce,
what I think of.
Territory management, all that kind of stuff. That is like what people think Salesforce is. I think that's probably the closest to it. But that ties in really well with B2B commerce, because those leads and opportunities might lead to that initial sale, and then you can use B2B for future use cases or for automation. CPQ also fits in that space for more kind of like hands-on quote generation and contract management.
And then they're basically using the Pardot version of the marketing that's more, like you said, lead gen versus the exact target, which is kind of more your traditional like
Yeah. I would say Pardot in the marketing cloud messaging and journeys tools, there's a blurry line there, but generally they map to B2B and B2C use cases.
That makes sense. How often are you guys seeing? I've actually had a customer in the past, only one, and it went okay. I think they had, some issues with strategy around their business that aren't necessarily due to the technology, but they were actually using Salesforce as the ERP. So they had an ERP add-on, B2B company, had some B2C. They ended up going with Magento because it kind of allowed for the B2C, B2B in one platform, but they were using Salesforce for their ERP. Are you seeing that often on the B2B side or not? I mean,
I don't, not often, no. And one of the things about Salesforce, and when I say it now, I'm talking about
it's an
that
add-on,
like
by the way. It's
product.
not like it wasn't the core product. It was like an app or
Right.
something.
But like an app exchange managed package or something. Yeah. The thing about that platform is you can sort of do anything with it, right? It's super, super flexible. You can extend it, do all sorts of things, but it's not always the right idea to do that. There's constraints around API and integration limits. There's constraints around data limits. You kind of pay for use. So
it's like you're trying to build like NetSuite in the app exchange, which is probably not necessarily the best.
Right. Maybe for some businesses, it's all you need, right? That I'm not saying it's a bad idea all the time, but I would definitely be very careful to explore how it's going to impact things like your licensing costs and your limits and such.
That makes sense. Okay, so that gives me a way better understanding, and hopefully for our listeners a better understanding of the ecosystem. And then there's a lot more products. It sounds like you kind of have these core 3 or 4 products based on use cases, and then from there you kind of like expand out based on what they might need.
And it's a lot depending on the industry too. I'd say that also, like, one thing is what type of business are we supporting, B2C, B2B, but then there's also industry specific tools like tools for HLS and tools for financial services and insurance and manufacturing. So
healthcare and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. So those industry
HIPAA compliant type things, or if you're selling.
Right. So we use Health Cloud in place of Service Cloud for some clients because it's more aligned towards patient support use cases than customer support use cases. So
that makes sense.
Depends.
So tell me about, with your background, I think you've been on the technology side quite a bit. What do you see as kind of the problems with companies trying to mature, whether it's B2C or B2B? I think more often than not, companies never get to that 15, 20, 30, 40, 50 million online. And I feel like they just get stuck. And we see this all the time. And then they blame the agency, or they're just kind of like, it's almost like they're spinning their wheels and they bounce around from agency to agency and never really get anywhere. And I'd imagine you've seen this over your career. Like, what are the things that you see happening? And it's usually, it's not just like, it's either partly tech, it's partly strategy. It's kind of like, I feel like it's that the alignment between the two is just not correct, right?
Yeah, honestly, yes. It's not. From my experience, it's rarely the technology's fault. I think one of the things that I see most commonly as a struggle is either trying to do too many things and doing none of them well. I think that can be a real pit.
In too short of a period of time, right? Like,
yeah,
I want to do everything.
We have to do everything.
Yeah,
but maybe we can't afford to do it all, or so you end up with like this kind of monumental but like buggy or inefficient experience,
half-built thing,
rather than exactly.
It's like trying to build a skyscraper, but you can only afford like a quarter of the skyscraper, right?
Right. Yeah, you put in the steel and then try to get tenants to move in and start paying the bills while you finish building it. Like, better to do it floor by floor. So
and I think the reason that companies do that is because they just don't understand, and the market is so all over the map. Like, someone will always tell you that it can be done, right? Like, if you go around and get a bunch of quotes, like, there's someone out there that'll be like, yeah, we'll build your skyscraper for that price. But then when it comes to actually, like you said, making it, picture perfect, not buggy, the reality is, I had a company the other day, they're like, we want a headless site. They wanted a few different back ends, and their budget was $100,000. And I was like,
Yeah,
No way.
that's
Like minimum, I mean, we're pretty competitive. I was like, maybe we could start at 200K. Like that's where we would start to have the conversation. Like that's where I was like,
right.
I'll have the conversation and maybe get you a proposal if that number doesn't like scare you away.
And we're still going to talk about what an MVP
Yeah, and
looks like.
that might still be an MVP, and maybe it's 250 or 300. So like,
Yeah.
but like there's someone and they're like, oh well, you know, these people are telling us there's people that can do it. It's like that's the problem. It's just like there's always someone out there that says they can do that. So I feel like there's kind of that problem that because it's not like a regulated industry, right? Like my guess is if you told someone you're going to build a skyscraper for 50 million and you just like didn't build it, I don't know, you'd probably get in trouble, or I'm not sure how that would work. Maybe that does happen, but
So
it seems to like in tech, it just happens all the time. But because it's an unregulated industry, anyone can friggin' be an agency, right? Like there's no
right.
I mean, you can have a certification for Salesforce or some of these things, but
There are certifications in the Salesforce space. The other pseudo mechanism is the partner relationship with Salesforce. Like if you botch a bunch of these, then Salesforce is just going to stop bringing you leads. But
for sure,
they can't stop people from hiring you. And we've definitely had some
exactly.
conversations.
That's my point.
Out of
right?
A bad implementation. Yeah. It is tricky. And if you don't, there's certain things like, I had a conversation with a prospect recently where they're like, we're gonna do our initial implementation ourselves. We've got a bunch of contractors, a lot of individual contributors. We think we can put this together, and maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong. But if you don't get the certain kind of stuff right out of the gate architecturally, it gets really expensive and hard to just take care of something long term. So that one of the things I would invest in is building a firm foundation, getting your customer data strategy right, getting your initial architecture right. And then if you want to just like be scrappy and iterate on top of that, go for it. But yeah, I always get a little nervous when I hear people try to roll their own when it comes to something as critical as commerce. You're really going to feel the pain if it goes down.
Especially if they don't have a lot of experience. Like, yeah, it's one thing when you're Amazon or you have like a big tech team and we're working with some customers that are pretty sophisticated and they do have their own internal tech teams, but they're still hiring us to augment that, right, on the Trellis side. But then, if you don't have, I think people don't realize that there's so many different skill sets, right? Like a developer, people think a developer can do everything. It's like, well, not really. A lot of developers might specialize in DevOps, or they might be a good front-end developer, not a good back-end developer. And then they might not be a good architect. Like you said, an architect is different than just a developer, right? And understanding the ecosystem. Not every architect is necessarily good at that. There's business strategy that goes into that. There's so many different things. And to your point, having that foundation is the most critical thing, because once you have a good foundation, you can iterate on it and it'll last you 5-10 years. But if you don't have that foundation, I mean, I talked to a company literally the other day, and in the first conversation, I was like, honestly, my recommendation is we kind of have to start over. Like that's my recommendation. I mean, it's not, I was like, we might be able to find a path forward with your existing architecture, but it's probably just going to limp along and not really get you where you want to be. And he's like, yeah, I kind of like, he kind of agreed, like he kind of understood where I was coming from, but obviously he wasn't the owner. So it's like, now we got to go up the chain of people and get them to buy in. So kind of starting over. And it's like, God knows how much money they've spent on this, basically not future forward architecture, right? It just, based on limitations and the things they had bought, they just weren't flexible enough to meet their needs, right?
But it's hard. It's hard. It's sometimes hard to make the business case for that. I can think of one time where we were able to, we do a lot of work in the B2C commerce space. I've been doing this for a long time, and I've been able to, for certain clients, say, I can tell you that we are spending twice as long to do pieces of work on your code base as we are to do this on other customers who have a new implementation or a cleaner implementation. We've just done this integration enough times, or this type of customization enough times. I know what it should take, and I know what it's taking over here because of this like Frankenstein's monster of a thing that's evolved over the last 6 years. And you're going to save money in the long run if you let us just rebuild it instead of continuing to patch and pile on. But it's rare that we can be so measured about that. We can tell you
it's
how
hard to
difficult
measure
it
that
is.
perfectly, but I think everyone deep down, developers, when they get into code base, they have some idea. And I think that's where businesses don't really understand, is because they typically don't have a lot of developers on staff. they're just trusting the agencies and maybe they're skeptical. And I don't think they realize that you could have two identical Salesforce sites, Magento sites, Shopify sites, I mean, I'm naming the popular, obvious platforms, and one could be 3 times the amount of cost to maintain for the exact same functionality. Like you could have two identical sites that do exactly the same thing, look exactly the same thing. And because of the way they are built, one could literally be 2 or 3 times more work to maintain because it just wasn't built well. I think that's a really hard concept for companies to understand because they're not developers, they're not coders, they don't see the code, they just see this thing in the browser that sort of works or doesn't work, that's all they see.
Yeah, and nobody, try explaining to a business that you're going to spend 6 months or a year to rebuild what they already have, right? Like it doesn't make it doesn't make sense really. So what we try to do, the best time to address that is when you can couple it with like a dramatic redesign or something that's going to force you to sort of redo a lot of stuff anyway. Then it's like, okay, well then let's just slide all this stuff out of the way and build from scratch. But just to do it for the sake of the technology, that's a hard sell, frankly.
Yeah, I think in those situations, like you said, there's kind of 2 paths, right? Make some minor incremental improvements, but be reasonable. Like you got to kind of, if you know that you have to get to a rebuild eventually, which I've been in that situation for our own company, it's like, I will be very careful about how much I invest in the incremental improvements. Some things I'll just be like, whatever, we're just going to not do that. Maybe invest in things like content that'll carry over, data, things that'll carry over into the rebuild, and then start kind of saving up for the rebuild, or spending more time on architecture so that you really get it right on the rebuild. And then that rebuild, maybe it's a redesign, adding some new functionality, something that it's not just rebuilding exactly what you have to make it more valuable.
Just back to your original question around like where we see kind of organizations get hung up, right? So one of them is trying to do too much and not doing it well. The other one I see even for fairly mature organizations is organizational silos and the way that people are measured within an organization. We've worked with customers that have Marketing Cloud and Service Cloud, and they have Commerce Cloud, and they're run by different business units, and no one person at the company understands them. They have different ideas of who the customer is. They have different analytics packages. They have different success
performance metrics. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
like the commerce guy's like, grow revenue, and then the service guy's like, well, I can't service all that revenue because it's I don't have the staff
per ticket
to do that.
or something.
Yeah,
they're getting measured on how quickly they can turn out call volume, and marketing is like how many click-throughs or response rates or open rates do they get in their emails. But like, how does all of that together turn into a business, right? And like, how do you convince people that by pulling all that stuff together and thinking more holistically about your organization, that you can understand, like, you can build marketing journeys off of customer service interactions and behavior on the site, or you can have your customer service agents be aware of what is in the customer's cart and help them with promo codes, or have efficiencies around being able to see order history and make changes to things like that. So having those larger scale conversations and building metrics and KPIs within an organization that support that sort of holistic view of your overall customer journey and their experience, regardless of like what touch point they're interacting with, is super hard, but really, really important. And it even goes into stores, right? Like we've had channel contention with online, quote unquote, like cannibalizing the in-store revenue, and like certain leaders within an organization are measured based on one or the other. And like, theoretically, we should want our customers to purchase from us however it is most efficient and effective for them, and as much as they care to buy. But if you've got kind of people who aren't really incentivized to support that cross-channel journey, then it's hard to build it, because who's going to back it and support it? You need buy-in.
Yeah, I think that's where a lot of these companies are just straight up broken, honestly.
Yeah.
And whether it's legacy B2B companies or retailers, that at the leadership level, they have created this old, like they're letting the old way of doing things, hurt their ability to move into the new way of doing things. And so they never really get to the next level with e-commerce. Which is where you look at the numbers every year, it's like most of the retail growth, e-commerce. most of the B2B growth, e-commerce or digital or self-serve or digitally enabled, right? It's like, it's where growth is. And if you're literally incentivizing your own company to compete with that, like that's just a fundamental basic business problem that like starts at the top. Honestly, that's where the CEO needs to come in and be like, all right, guys, we're, total revenue is what matters. If in-store pickup is growing, great, the store is growing, because you buy online and pick up in store, right? Which is a big part of e-commerce, right? But is it e-commerce or is it in store, right? It's both,
Right.
right? And it's like, that's where, or omni-channel, maybe you have really, I mean, Walmart is a good example, like because they have so many stores, they're able to get closer and closer to 1-day shipping because they can do localized shipping, right? So you could use it to your advantage with e-commerce by having all these stores, right? Instead of just seeing it as like, when you start competing against yourself, it's generally a bad sign for the company.
Right. Yeah, and it's tricky to get it right, but when we do strategy engagements, I'm working on one right now where our goal is to provide a kind of a prescriptive recommendation across a lot of different brands and technologies for how commerce and marketing architecture should be set up. But before we even worry about technology, like my questions and conversation are around how your organization is structured, like who is running your marketing sites now and your commerce sites now. And if I were to give you a solution that requires those two things to work closely together, what would the process be like for doing things like deploying changes or tracking down bugs or tracking a customer's journey as they move between these different properties and technologies? Like, are you set up to do that, and how does it work? And often when I ask questions like, where are the inefficiencies, where are the struggles right now, that my obvious next question is like, who could fix that? Like if we were to take this technology group, this commerce group, this marketing group, and work our way up the pyramid, because all organizations are kind of shaped like a pyramid. There's somebody at the top. Like, how far do we have to go before we find somebody who can fix this broken thing? And to your point, often it's all the way to the top, and that's really that's a lot to ask for operational inefficiencies that are down kind of at the execution level.
Yeah, and that's why I think CEOs need to get more hands-on. I think that CEOs and executives, they need to go a couple levels below to see what's really going on. And I think a lot of them are just really out of touch with reality, or they just see the numbers, or they build this website, right? And it's just like very high level stuff that's why these things fail, because they don't really know what the problem is. And then the agency or someone becomes the scapegoat. That's what I always find too, is like someone in the organization gets fired or the agency gets fired, but it doesn't really solve the real problem, right? Like it's just like a band-aid solution to a much bigger problem that I see happen all the time, where it's a combination. Sometimes I see people get fired and the agency get fired, right? And they just think, obviously sometimes the agency is the problem or part of the problem, but it's usually not the entire problem, right?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, everyone's trying to protect themselves and their organization as best they can. But I remember a sales conversation. Salesforce, or back in the Demandware days, they had professional services. They would do their own implementation, but they really didn't like to. They preferred to use partners. And I remember a sales conversation where we were talking to a prospect, and they insisted on getting a quote from Demandware Professional Services because they figured they're the experts, and it was twice what we were quoting, and we weren't cheap, but it was twice as much because they don't really want to do that type of work. And the buyer that I was talking to said, if I hire them and it's a mess, nobody's going to blame me because I paid them to do it on their platform. If I hire you because you're less expensive and it's a mess, it's my fault because I chose to go with what looks like a riskier proposition. And that was a really interesting bit of insight for me that just like helped me understand sometimes the decision makers, like there's a risk avoidance there. So how I frame this deal or this conversation might be more about why we are the safer option than the least expensive option, depending on who the buyer is.
Yeah, and that's often, I totally agree. I think a lot of companies don't realize that by going cheap, in some cases, it's super risky. In some case, maybe not. Maybe it's actually less risky, right? Because, you know, if you go with, you know, some big giant provider, they might just not care that much if you're a small fish. If you're a tiny little customer of some giant provider, it might not matter if the project fails to them.
Right.
You know what I mean?
And
So
their staff turns
yeah,
over, you know,
yeah,
just like everybody else's does.
exactly.
Just because they work there doesn't mean they know any more about the technology than we do. You know,
Yeah, it's really about
clear.
fit, right? It's like, how do you find the right fit? And
Right.
that's what we've gotten a lot better at as an agency, is like, you know, we might not be the right fit for a Fortune 500 company for some crazy big global project right now, but you know, there's certain kind of projects where they're either too small or they're too big or the right fit, right? So
Yeah.
that's where you kind of have to figure that out. And I think customers, especially in B2B, I think that's a big problem in B2B, is because it's kind of newer in a lot of ways to them. Like they haven't gone through 3 or 4 implementations or 2 or 3. Like a lot of times it's their first real implementation. They just have no idea. They're just like very much looking at the price. And I think that's a big reason why the B2B e-commerce industry needs to mature. I feel like it's still very price driven. A lot of our conversations are, oh, well, they're just looking for kind of like a cheap quote, you know?
Yeah. And I think, you know, we also as providers, I think, and also the platforms, you know, I think Salesforce does this to some extent. I'm sure Adobe and Magento and BigCommerce, like they do the same things, but we need to get a little bit better at articulating the business reasons for building a B2B site, because like they're probably selling B2B already, right? They have a process of doing it. And yes, we can, you know, talk about it's going to be more efficient, you know, some people prefer it, but like, how do you measure that growth? Because we can very specifically tell them how much it's going to cost to do it, but like sometimes it's a lot harder to tell them, well,
Yeah,
what's the upside?
I agree. And I think that's a big reason why B2B struggles with this stuff, is because in B2C, usually they can more justify like, oh, we have a better site, we'll do more marketing, we'll increase our conversion rate. It's like very new customer acquisition, retention. Like it's a much easier conversation to
Right.
have because, you know,
And I'm not going to call Nike and buy a pair of shoes from a salesperson, right? Like that's not
it's just
not an
not a
option.
thing. Yeah. I
So
mean, a lot of our B2B e-commerce conversations are like, we don't want, like, I've had many where they're like, we don't want new customers. That's not the goal of this project.
yeah.
They're like, their goal of the project is to just allow people to buy online. Right. But I think it really, to reframe the conversation, I really think it's about, honestly, surviving as a business. I really believe that if you don't start to take the architecture seriously and build this foundation of digital first, over time you will become more and more irrelevant, especially as a distributor, right? If you're a distributor, your value proposition, you don't make the product. All you do is take product, bring it to another business, and there's more and more channels and ways to get product than ever before. And if you don't make that digitally enabled and more digitally efficient, I just see you becoming more and more relevant. And then on the manufacturer brand side, I think that there's just more and more competition. So, you know, yeah, you might have a unique product, but with 3D printing, you know, everyone's a startup these days. Like there's just so much room for, you know, Amazon's private labeling things. You can't just sit on your laurels and be like, we have the patent for this thing and, you know, we make this widget and, you know, you have to call me to get it, right? Like I just don't see that as like a viable long-term strategy anymore. You know?
Yeah, I think the buyers are changing and will continue to change at, you know, like the people who want to purchase from you as they become more digitally mature in their expectations around like how things should be purchased in a general sense change. Like the idea that they're gonna call or like fax something in, or you know whatever the current process is going to get increasingly onerous and challenging. So yeah, it's definitely about the future of how your business is going to work.
Well, Tesla, I think, is one of my favorite examples, right? Because they are purely B2C as a manufacturer for the most part. But actually, I mean, they probably have a lot of business customers, right? People that, you know, maybe buy the trucks, or there's probably a whole side of that I don't really understand, but it exists.
But they don't go through dealers.
Yeah, they don't go through dealers. So what's super interesting about them is because they have developed this direct, you know, online super efficient process, they're not spending so much money on the middleman and marketing. they're focusing almost all their money on R&D. I saw some graph that their R&D money is just like so much higher than their competitors, and it was like kind of shocking. It's like 3 times the closest competitor is R&D. And it's like that's where the efficiency comes, right? I mean, I think that nowadays the ability to create new products and evolve new products faster and faster that's the competitive marketing advantage. If all your money is just, you know, TV ads, I don't see that as a long-term viable strategy either, right? Or
right. And I think that goes to what we maybe kind of started the conversation about a while ago, which is if you're a manufacturer and you primarily are a B2B business right now, if people know your brand and they want to buy it, then experimenting with direct to consumer is an interesting proposition, because in some cases, you know, you're going to cut out a whole layer of middleman. You're going to have some operational efficiencies and drive some direct sales. Now, obviously, there are relationships that can sometimes be tricky to navigate with that, but like, my least favorite part of buying a car is the dealership experience, like going to 3 different dealers. I know what I want to buy. Now I have to figure out who's going to sell it to me and like how that's going to work. Like if I want to buy a pair of Adidas shoes or something, should I go to 3 or 4 different shoe stores to figure out which one's the cheapest? No, I just want to buy it from Adidas. Like I just want the pair of shoes.
Yeah,
right?
you Google it, you find the right price that, you know, you might be able to compare a little bit, but probably within 5 minutes you'll be able to find the cheapest price, you know. Online.
So I think that's an area that's sort of ripe for growth right now, is just direct to consumer for manufacturers who are traditionally not doing that. And you don't have to spend, you know, $750,000 to build a Cadillac e-commerce site. You know, you can stand up a B2C channel and see what traction.
Start somewhere, right? Yeah, like you said, start somewhere, but don't assume that you're going to start with the Cadillac if you're starting from scratch, right? Like, and I think that's where companies go wrong, to your point, is like e-commerce is such an evolution of many different things that just throwing money at it alone doesn't even necessarily solve the problem, because it's this cultural maturity that's hard to even explain, right? It's like you need the people and the culture and the processes, and it's like the only way to get there is to start somewhere, and you kind of have to start at like the used Honda is probably the better way to think about it, right?
Yeah, and not that I'm comparing it to a used Honda, but in the B2C space, like if this is your first experiment with it, for Salesforce B2B clients who want to go direct to consumer, this new B2B2C thing is great. But if you're not in the Salesforce ecosystem and you just want to like try this out, like Shopify is a great way to do that. Like Shopify takes care of so much for you. But when we do have clients who have outgrown Shopify and they're looking at B2C commerce, there's often a lot of conversations around like new partners that you have to find, like an order management solution and a payment solution, and a bunch of things that Shopify just kind of like does. You know, now we're integrating it into this.
It's more enterprise. They're more specialized technologies when
definitely
you get to that next scale,
you know,
right? Like
I think the buzzword is composable commerce, this idea of being able to like pick and choose the best of breed solutions. But it's more work. It's more
work, and you need to be able to justify it, right? You know, if you're doing 50 million online, probably makes sense. But if you're doing 1 million online, like you probably are going to have a hard time justifying that versus just like a Shopify, because
for sure,
you know, you're obviously not making a ton of. Because people think it's like 1 million isn't a lot when you like the profit on that is, you know, maybe $200,000, or you know, the net profit. You know, it's like even that might even only be $100,000 or $50,000, right? So like at the end of it, when you pay, you know, pay all your people and pay all the cost of goods and shipping, so there's not a lot left over. So I mean, I'd love to, you know, we're kind of running out of time here, but I'd love to hear maybe your a little more advice around the architecture. I think that is so underrated, and something that we struggle with ourselves, honestly, is like pitching the value of architecture first. And you know, just to be transparent, at Trellis, the way we do it is we'll usually give someone kind of a high level proposal and be like, hey, you know, we think it's going to be this, but like until we do architecture, we're not 100% sure. We really need to do architecture, and that's a paid engagement. And I think a lot of companies really struggle with that, or a lot of B2B companies especially struggle with the idea of like paying, you know, 10, 20 grand, potentially more, for architecture, because they're just like, well, I'm paying money to find out what I'm going to get. Like, it's like hard for them to wrap their head around it. But if you think about a building, it's like you don't build a skyscraper without, you know, in-depth architecture and things up front, right? So could you maybe, I think you've done a lot of that in your career. So could you talk a little bit about that process, and maybe you guys do it a
Yeah.
little bit differently, but what you might advise?
I think we just maybe call it something different. So all of our projects that we sell include a paid discovery phase or a
We call it
blueprint
discovery too.
phase. Yeah,
Discovery
it's
architecture kind of,
so,
they're
and
similar.
we always
Yeah,
do.
yeah.
We usually do as granular a proposal as possible. But there's always a end of discovery kind of true up moment where we say, here's all the stuff that we didn't know that we found out
Yeah.
about, and reconcile around that. So
And
that's
I think that's
similar.
important to know, right? Like there's only so much you guys can do for free in the sales process, right?
Right.
Like you can't do the full sit. I mean, you could, but I'm assuming it would just be too expensive to do that on every deal, right?
Yeah,
Like,
and we make some assumptions around things that we can't. We look at the current experience. We ask questions around your integrations. We map it out as best we can, but there's always more detail to find out. But the value of it is basically, I've spent most of my career in the post-launch support world. So I've spent a whole lot of time with inherited code bases and inherited sites that I
so you've seen some really bad stuff.
I've seen some really bad stuff, but I've also gotten woken up at 2 o'clock in the morning because someone's checkout is broken. And that's where the value of architecture, and more specifically architectural documentation, really stands out, because your team, even if you build it yourself, your team's going to turn over, things are going to change. And when somebody gets woken up in a critical situation at 3 o'clock in the morning, the value of a very clear architectural diagram and integration specs and API specs and data modeling really stands out, because with the right documentation, I can get to the root of that problem very quickly, because I can see what the touch points are, what the potential integrations and frictions are, and then I can figure out what third-party vendor I need to contact because your tax isn't working or checkout's broken or something like that. So that's a really important part of it for me. I feel like documentation, yes, you need it to build the site. I need to be able to communicate to developers what I need them to do in order for this to be successful. But then that artifact has value for the long term as well. I think that's really important. More mature customers are going to want that. They're going to want that deliverable for its own sake, but it's
because they've seen what happens when you don't have it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I can't tell you. I mean, I feel like maybe not 50%, but a good chunk of our clients are essentially rescues where they've gotten to a certain point and it's clearly failing, and we've had to come in and either start over or kind of refactor things or pick up the pieces. And I think people don't realize how common those rescues are, right?
Yeah, and it's tough because in a lot of those cases, the damage is done, right? Like we were talking about earlier, it's hard to come out of that, and it's
$300,000 on a not working thing, and it's like,
yeah.
Well, it's gonna be another $300,000 to get it working, and then it's like, well, our budget was only $300,000.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's why we see. I'm sure you guys see the same thing, but we see a lot of repeat business from customers who have moved to other organizations, like people that we've worked with at one organization. They've learned to trust us, often as individuals. So even when I've been with Slalom for not even a year now. I've had customers that I worked with when I was in another organization, they were in another organization. Yeah. They find me because they're like, this is a person that
at least I trust you
and want to work with again. Right. So I think holding on to those relationships and once you figure it out is really important.
You said something really important that I want to kind of end on. What is your advice on, I think people kind of have this fantasy that the team's not going to change and agencies don't have turnover and companies don't have turnover. We have a client right now, I'm not going to name, a very large company that has so much turnover internally that we basically just like the original people that we did the project with are all like, everyone's gone. It's like, we had to put everything on pause. Budgets have changed. It's just such a mess that we're just like, hey man, you told us this original budget. Now you're changing the budget. Well, our scope doesn't fit this new budget. Like, it's become such a mess that like we've had to kind of almost pause that client for a little while. I think companies basically have this fantasy that, you hire an agency, you're going to get all the same people indefinitely. And there's inevitably going to be change and turnover and people changing over the course of years. But I think if you do it right and you do it well, you can have enough consistency and overlap between people over the years and documentation that the code base becomes stronger, in some ways better over time, and processes get better. And I've seen some of our better customers, we were actually get more efficient by like the third year of maintenance on their website. It depends on the customer, but like, what is your advice for dealing with that or minimizing the risk of that across multiple, company, agency, freelancers? You have this like mix of people usually is what happens.
Definitely. I think for the health of the project overall, it's important. Like the documentation is really important. I come back to that a lot, but I think overlap is also really important. Like you should be able to lose anyone on the team at any given time and not have it throw the entire project off.
Yeah.
You can't lose half the team. You can't,
if
that all happens at once,
a little
tricky.
bit, but you should be able to lose anyone on the project on any side of the company and still be able to finish the project.
Exactly.
Then let's say a plus or minus 20% or something. Maybe it delays it by 10 or 20% or something, but it shouldn't completely destroy the project.
Right. And if it does, then that should be addressed long before it happens, right? If there's one person on the project where you can point to that person and say, like, if they stop coming to work tomorrow, we would not be able to move forward.
The bus factor isn't that what we call it, developer?
Yeah,
it's the
exactly.
hit by the bus factor.
Yeah. So that's got to be addressed up front. Other than that, like, having good internal KT, making sure that when you have to do a transition, that there is some overlap, that there's some knowledge transfer, that your client doesn't repeat themselves. I have found one of the things that clients find the most frustrating is when someone asks them a question that they should already know the answer to because they've already told it to Slalom 3 times already.
Yeah, but wasn't told to that specific person.
Exactly.
They didn't know, or they weren't on the call. And
exactly, the burden is on us to make sure that people are up to speed, they have the right language, they understand the client relationship, and when they come to their first call, they already sound like a part of the team. Like that, if we can do that right, then that trust, I think, gets established really quickly. But if that first impression, the first time a new consultant joins the call, they don't know what they're getting into. They're asking some really basic questions. They don't understand the scope of the project. Like, if that happens in front of the customer, it's incredibly difficult to regain that trust because they've already formed that impression, like, oh, this person, they don't know what they're doing. And that may not be true. They may have just been unprepared for the conversation. But
some advice to those new employees or people making the mistake: ask your team first before you ask the customer directly on a call.
And take the time to have that. I mean, I've been guilty of it myself, where I'm like, oh, this person's great, they'll hit the ground running, let's just pull them in. If we don't have that internal conversation first to prep somebody and get them, you're just not setting them up for success, and it's going to frustrate the client. So I think if we do that a couple of times and sometimes proactively change people out, like if someone's been on a project for a year or working with the same client for a year, then I'm going to take some time and talk to them and say, like, hey, is it time for a change? Like, should we transition this? You're going to learn more somewhere else. We want to make sure that you're not just kind of like getting into a rut over here and waiting for that to burn itself out. I think if you manage it and establish a cadence, it's okay.
Yeah, having redundancy, I think, is super important, right? Like, we like to have some sort of redundancy in as many positions as possible, or layers of additional kind of backup. If someone's on PTO, the project just doesn't kind of completely stop. So we'll usually have, especially on the technical side, we'll usually have quite a bit of redundancy. On the project management side, it can be a little bit harder because it's hard to have like a backup PM that knows what's going on, because that's probably one of the harder areas to, I think, have redundancy, but we have certain layers and things to kind of combat that. But yeah, I totally agree. I think that too many companies just assume that, you throw things, you just, the e-commerce manager will get it all done, and then the agency will have this one guy will get it all done. It's like, it's not really a great long-term strategy. You need some sort of kind of redundancy for PTO and sick time and the inevitable turnover over the course of multiple years, which is going to happen, especially if you're talking about 3, 4, 5 years.
And in this industry, right? Like the tech industry in general is super competitive. Like, lifespans at a company are measured in 2 years is a
Yeah, it's like, yeah,
pretty
18
good
months is like the
expectation. Yeah.
average. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
pretty
So
insane. Yeah.
it's pretty rare that you have somebody around for a long time. So it's going to happen. Obviously everybody does their best around retention and tries to maintain the team. Like, we don't want to disrupt anything, but I think we just have to be prepared for it because it's a reality.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that companies need to do a better job realizing the value of retention, whether it's contractors or employees, and having that overlap and having documentation and redundancy,
right?
And not just treating everyone as expendable, because that's where I've seen things just kind of fall apart. Is all of a sudden,
Yeah.
I can't tell you, I've talked to clients who have come into rescue and they literally have no idea what's going on, right? Like, they don't know the code base, they don't know the architecture, there's no documentation. It's like almost like starting from scratch. And it's like, you spend all this money and no one can tell me how anything works. Like,
That's scary.
it's kind of crazy, right? That exists all the time. I think you probably see that a little bit less on like the Commerce Cloud, Salesforce side, because those are probably more mature customers that have like gotten past that stage, right?
Yeah.
But like some of these smaller stores, or especially on the B2B side, that's what I'm telling you. On the B2B side, I'm seeing it way too often where it's like, there's just like no context because it's their first or second site, right? And
I don't know if BigCommerce or any of the platforms you work with do this, but Salesforce actually, at least on the B2C side, they actually have a paid engagement for every new implementation that they call the site readiness assessment process. But it starts with a tech review, a spec review. So you have to have tech specs that they review before you go into implementation that describe all of your architecture and implementation. Then they do like a launch readiness kind of shortly before, where they actually look at the implementation.
I can tell you right now, no.
Yeah, it's nice actually.
They
I
try and sell
it.
kind of these premium services to some customers, but it's more of a nice to have. I mean, Shopify has over 1 million customers. So you think they are doing that for 1 million customers?
No.
Obviously, plus, they have a little bit more of that, but there is no, required standard. I mean, anyone can technically really do a Shopify Plus site. Anyone can sell it. It's just like, it's kind of the wild, wild west in this area. And I think that's why companies don't realize that they all of a sudden could have this very fragile infrastructure, because there's no controls really.
There's probably more of a cushion for it at certain volumes too. Like I've worked on B2C commerce sites that sell $20-30 million in a day. So it's versus, I think if that isn't designed well, that can just grind to a halt.
Yeah, the large customers, there's visibility. Like, I guarantee you, Shopify, Magento, BigCommerce, if it's a major customer, they're paying attention.
Yeah,
the problem is they have 1 million customers. Right. So if you're kind of in the middle ground, maybe you have a customer success manager. It's his first week on the job, right? And he's 3 years out of college, and you think he really is gonna you think he's really gonna move the needle on making sure you have the right architecture?
He'll notice when it breaks, but not
he'll respond when you tell him your store is broken. Or she.
It depends on the scale. I guess
Salesforce Commerce Cloud can do that, I think, because each customer to them is worth a lot. They only have a few thousand customers, right? On the
I don't know the total number now, but it's not the number.
It's not 1 million customers, right?
Volume,
it's not
it's fewer larger customers. So
exactly.
It's a little bit more bespoke in terms of service.
Yeah, I'd say Adobe Commerce Cloud is closer to that, where they have, now that Adobe's taken over, they don't have 1 million customers on Adobe Commerce Cloud. So if you're paying for Adobe Commerce Cloud, you have a customer success manager, there's definitely more. I'm not sure they are requiring any sort of like documentation. But I know there's a lot more communication. We just had a launch yesterday, actually, and they were looped into emails. It was very collaborative, more so than I've seen on some of the other platforms. But I will say, I think BigCommerce does a really good job of upfront sales engineering. I think they're one of the better platforms. I think they're kind of underrated. They're kind of the smallest of the four that we're talking about. So like Salesforce and Magento are kind of the bigger enterprise players. Shopify's like just by far the most volume, and then everyone kind of like forgets about BigCommerce. And I think because they're a little bit smaller, they can be a little bit more hands-on because they don't have a million customers, right? Like Shopify does. So, but yeah, I'm not sure they're requiring what you're saying. But that's interesting. That's great to hear that they do that. It definitely
provides some guardrails, and it also provides some air cover for us as implementation partners when we have to tell a client that what they're trying to do is not a great idea, like for performance reasons or something.
This is not going to pass the
exactly.
Salesforce. Like
Salesforce isn't going to let us launch.
You're like literally,
nonsense,
we will not be allowed to launch this website. Yeah.
So a little air cover there. That's helpful.
And it probably helps you guys sell discovery, right? Because that's one of the challenges is like, with some of the other platforms, that's not a requirement. So like you could just start a project with nothing. Like you could just throw out a proposal and start a project.
Yeah, that's wild. That's scary. I don't even want to contemplate that.
yeah, exactly. So, well, I don't want to take up any more of your time. This was awesome. We'll definitely have to, maybe we'll have one with you and Mike. We can have the Mike and Mike version of Salesforce on the podcast together.
Sounds great. Yeah. No, this is fun. Thanks for inviting me on. I really appreciate it. It's been fun talking to you.
All right. Thank you, Mike. And we'll be in touch.
Thanks a lot.